All right, so let's get going. Steve, Ramy, Jennifer, and Danielle, which I think at least 3 of you seem to be in the audience already. So let's get going. And hear your talk on relevance for persuasion. And could I just ask everybody else in the audience to make sure that they're muted during the talk?
Okay, thank you very much. So I trust you can hear me and see my screen. Okay, so this is a talk, kind of a hybrid talk because in its origin, because it contains old ideas I've been toying around with for a few years, and a very recent work within this Amore project, which is an argumentative model of rephrase that we want to use to talk about persuasion. So this is work conducted in collaboration with Ramy, Jennifer, and Daniel, who are here, making sure that I don't say anything stupid as well. Okay, very briefly, I will start with a few words on stuff that you all know. So it's going to be quite fast: cognitive principle of relevance, extend conditions of relevance, and information selection. Move on to explain how we can use the RT framework, the RT architecture, to talk about persuasiveness as well, and then take you to some experimental findings in that direction. All right, so RT has traditionally been used to explain ostensive communicative behavior. It gives us a very comprehensive account of verbal comprehension and pragmatic inference, but recently it has extended its reach to capture phenomena beyond comprehension. I'm thinking here about recent work on emotions and non-propositional meaning. There was a special issue with lots of papers on this. Work on emotions by Constant and Louis Saussure and Tim Morton. And this morning, the panel on relevance, emotion, and non-propositional meaning was very much in relation to this. We would say that this is quite unsurprising if we look at the formulation of the cognitive principle of relevance, which is formulated as follows: human cognition tends to be geared to the maximization of relevance. And here it says human cognition, which presumably captures all cognitive activity, including, and this is what we're interested in, the processing of arguments. Going a bit further, if we think of relevance seeking as a cognitive mechanism, by definition, that's a mechanism that is meant to select information. So pragmatic inference, as defined in the theory, is meant to identify a plausible candidate for speaker meaning through a process that singles out pieces of information in the cognitive environment. So that search for relevance is also taken to drive the entire interpretation process. That is, it drives the, it constrains the output that is arrived at through considerations of relevance, but it also constrains the search for contextual assumptions that you will use to get there, all right? So in other words, our cognitive system, whatever the task, selects information it deems relevant, at least so we can assume based on the cognitive principle of relevance. And the nice part about this theory is that it says that we have 2 criteria for this selection: the extent conditions of relevance, which are formulated as follows. An assumption is relevant in a context to the extent that its contextual effects in this context are large. And the second one has to do with processing effort. An assumption is relevant in a context to the extent that the effort required to process it in this context is small. And that gives us a very technical understanding of what relevance is, a very definite understanding. Relevance is achieved when the mind of an individual considers that a given piece of information has optimally satisfied the 2 conditions. Okay, so this was a quick recap on the tools that we're going to use to talk about persuasiveness. So we want to see whether we can apply these notions to the processing of arguments. And by arguments, I mean minimally any sequence of utterances in which at least 1 or 2 pieces of information are used to support another piece of information. So there are premises and a standpoint. And we want to see whether relevance can have something to say about this thing that I'm circling with my mouse. I hope you can see it. Can you not? Yeah, okay, thanks. All right, so if we think about persuasion in a very reductionist way, in cognitive terms, persuasion succeeds when the content of the standpoint that is put forward by the speaker makes it into the addressee's cognitive environment. And in the case of argumentation, 2 sets of information interact to reach that goal. One is the content of the argumentation that is offered, so what the speaker tells you, his or her premises and the standpoint. And the second set of information interacting with the first is the set of assumptions that you summon as an addressee to evaluate the argumentation, what we call the critical context, whatever you can think of to evaluate whether you should go with the reasons that the speaker is offering for their standpoint. So processing an argument or evaluating it involves figuring out how compatible these two sets of information are. If they turn out not to be compatible, which one prevails over the other and why? In other words, are you going to reject the argument and the standpoint, or are you going to let it in into your cognitive environment? So driving this reflection a bit further, what could be the circumstances in which an argument could be said to be persuasive? Well, that happens when the content of the argument is compatible with your critical context, or when the content of the argument withstands anything you can throw at it in terms of counter-arguments or objections. Another case, circumstance would be that the argument is persuasive when it's accepted because basically you don't have anything critical to object to it, or you don't have reasons to summon anything critical at that point. And these two cases actually highlight two parameters: the epistemic strength of information. So the first scenario here is about which piece of information wins in epistemic terms. And the second has to do with the accessibility of information, whether you're able to summon counter evidence or critical objections. And these two are very similar to the extent conditions of relevance. One would relate to cognitive effect, which in RT is defined in epistemic terms most of the time, adding reliable new information or rejecting old information that turns out to be inaccurate, or strengthening old information that was uncertain. And the second parameter relates to cognitive effort and accessibility, whether you're going to be able to summon information for that. So the hypothesis is that these extent conditions of relevance are also at play in the evaluation of arguments, and they might determine whether the standpoint they defend, the arguments defend, makes it into the cognitive environment of the addressee, that is, whether the argumentation is persuasive or not. In graphical terms, if your content in the argumentation that is offered to you if the content is very accessible, epistemically strong, and it's met with a critical context that is less accessible and epistemically weaker, then persuasion should succeed. If, on the other hand, everything else being equal, of course, the content is not very accessible, say maybe difficult to understand or cryptic or whatever, and epistemically weak, that you judge it to be epistemically weak, within a context that is actually highly accessible and epistemically strong, then persuasion should not work. That's for the model. Let's see now what we have tried to do to see whether that can be met. That's an idea that can translate into experimental results. So this model can be tested, and as many things in relevance theory, they can be tested quite straightforwardly. Our items will be arguments. So we're going to have premise, conclusion, premise, standpoint pairs. We're going to measure persuasiveness. Our conditions will have to do with variations in processing effort and cognitive effect. And we use, classical methods in experimental pragmatics. So the initial evidence I'm going to present today comes from our project on rephrase. It's a bilateral project with Polish colleagues at the Warsaw University of Technology. And in that project, which is not only RT based, we combine corpus and computational methods with experimental methods to study rephrase in argumentation. So here, let me take you back to the work of Diane Blakemore on reformulation, because she was the one to talk about similar phenomena within the RT framework. According to Blakemore, reformulations in planned or unplanned discourse make a contribution more relevant. When it's unplanned, it's a kind of repair that tries to remedy previous communicative failure. Something like, I want to see my uncle, I mean my cousin. The second segment is reformulating the first as a correction, and in that sense, it gains relevance, because it's said to better represent the speaker's meaning. And in planned discourse, reformulation and the original statement taken together are more relevant than the original alone or the reformulation alone. And here's an example from Blakemore. At the beginning of this piece, there's an example of an anacrusis. That is, it begins with an unaccented note that is not part of the first full bar. So the reformulation here provides a definition of what an anacrusis is, and in that sense makes it more relevant. So in theory, reformulation increases relevance in terms of effect because it improves informativeness, completeness, however you want to call it. And in terms of processing effort, perhaps it facilitates processing because it's announced as more of the same. So your cognitive environment has already processed information related to what's coming next. So that might ease the processing of the second segment. Now, what about reformulation in argumentative context? We want to call that rephrase. And we define it following quite loosely for now. That's one of the part of the project. We need to come up with an airtight definition. But here we built on the work of Basha Konat colleague and her colleagues, who says that rephrase is a relation which holds between two text spans which have the same argumentative function, but different linguistic surface, and therefore should not be considered as two arguments pro or two arguments con by analytics and argument mining systems. In other words, two text units are in the relation of rephrase when substitution of one unit for another preserves the argument structure. So premise will be rephrased into a premise, a standpoint will be rephrased into a standpoint, a challenge will be rephrased into a challenge, and so on. You don't have cross-category transformations that would not correspond to rephrase. Now, we define it as a type of intentional reformulation, just like paraphrase, which preserves the argumentative function of the statement that it rephrases. That is, a rephrase is not in conflict with or an argument or standpoint of the statement that it rephrases. Usually is performed for rhetorical gain. We'll say a few things about this. And there also can be misuses of rephrase, typically the straw man fallacy, where you misrepresent what someone has said to try to attack them more easily. That would be a misuse of other rephrase when you phrase someone else's words. So here's an example from political discourse, primary debate, democratic debate in 2015, where the moderator asks Clinton the following. You mentioned radical jihadists. Marco Rubio, also running for president, said that this attack showed, and the attack in Paris showed that we are at war with radical Islam. Do you agree with that characterization, radical Islam? And Clinton says, I don't think we're at war with Islam. I don't think we're at war with all Muslims. I think we're at war with jihadists who have, and then just to interrupt, he didn't say all Muslims, he just said radical Islam. Is that a phrase you don't? And blah, blah, blah. So you see here that Hillary Clinton rephrased radical Islam into Islam, and then rephrased her own Islam into all Muslims. Though related, they don't denote the same realities. Okay, so that would be a misuse of rephrase, but you can probably see that there is something rhetorical at play in here. So we conducted a pilot study on rephrase a couple of years ago, then we published it at the beginning of this year. And basically we're just interested to know whether people perceive something odd or different about rephrase when compared to no rephrase. So we took items taken from the corpora that our Polish colleagues had identified and annotated, and we isolated statements of this with this structure. Segment 1, which was kept constant into all conditions, and segment 2, which was instantiating a rephrase or a no rephrase. Our conditions were rephrase. We had two types, generalizing and specifying. So something like there were, I'm going to give you examples in a minute, so sorry. I'm going to not lose time now. We contrasted that to no rephrase, and we had an inference condition where we used an argument from consequences, which was the second most prevalent category in the corpus that we had, to make sure that if there is an effect of rephrase, at least we can compare it to an argumentative condition so that we can't say that people just saw something argumentative in rephrase, but we don't really know what. And we had a judgment task. We basically asked people to evaluate the persuasiveness of the statements, and we saw the following. So results were significant. The first here is inference, so the argument from consequences. The second is no rephrase, and the third is rephrase. And we see that these two, so inference and rephrase, they pattern together, which suggests that rephrase first positively affects the persuasiveness of the message when you compare it to no rephrase, and that it somehow seems to behave like an argument. So we had a couple of other experiments, but the latest ones, we decided to go insert the items within an argumentative structure. That is, participants saw segment 1 and segment 2, but this time these two were followed by a standpoint, which was of the form and therefore X. I'm going to show you an example in a minute. Again, we used the items from the corpora that we had, and we edited them to make them as similar as possible across conditions. And we made sure that the second segment was structurally similar to the first segment so that we minimize variation between both, and because it makes it also easier to process. So something like, I'm pretty open about it, I'm pretty open about this particular subject would be a sample item, where this in blue rephrases what we have in the first, and you see that the structure is parallel, the syntactic structure is parallel. We had a within and between subject design. I'm going to talk about this first one, the within design for the rephrase condition. We also tested something with discourse markers. We had I mean and that is. I'm not going to go into the details of this. We're still analyzing, but we do have something interesting, I think, to say about the first one. All right, so here's a sample item. All items were preceded by a short introductory statement about what it was. Participants were told that these were statements that were coming from debates. And then they had to answer a question about the persuasiveness of what they saw. So we had these conditions, rephrase and no rephrase, once with I mean and once with that is. So something like, those feelings were felt by a majority of people. I mean, those feelings were felt by 60% of the population. That was a specification of majority to 60%. And the no rephrase condition, those feelings were felt by a majority of people. I mean, this is what I think about past mentalities of that time. So this statement here is not a rephrase of segment 1. And the conclusion, therefore, we should not remain idle and instead change these feelings. This is what I'm interested in right now. So this is what they saw. These are two sample items with rephrase and without rephrase. Here we have with the connective I mean. And upon reading this, they were simply asked, how persuasive do you find this statement? And then they have to click on this to make the cursor appear and slide it towards not at all or very according to their preference. All right, so bear in mind, in theory, rephrase, which is a type of reformulation, should increase relevance. And also our pilot study indicated that rephrase seems to behave like an argument. And here are the results. This is the no rephrase condition, this is the rephrase condition, and this is the perceived persuasiveness scale. So indeed, when you use it in an argumentative structure, that is, in a structure where it's used as a premise, next to a premise to support a standpoint, rephrase indeed increases the perceived persuasiveness of argumentation. All right, so in terms of extent conditions of relevance, if indeed rephrase, as said in the theory, increases relevance through increasing cognitive effects, then we can see that when it's used in an argumentative setting, it increases perceived persuasiveness. And if it increases relevance through decreasing processing effort, and here we try to enforce that by using the same syntactic structure to facilitate processing, then when it's used argumentatively, we saw that it translates into an increase of perceived persuasiveness. So that's actually the first study in argumentation that shows that relevance does affect perceived persuasiveness. The result is that the more relevant an utterance, the more persuasive it is perceived. And in methodological terms, this is promising because it shows us that we can use RT not just to look at comprehension, but also to look at phenomena related to persuasion. Further work, and that's my last slide. So we're at the beginning of the project. It started this year. We want to do tons of things, among which find out about types of rephrase, patterns of rephrase, and their linguistic resources. We want to identify different types of rhetorical effects of rephrase. Here I showed you something about perceived persuasiveness, but we are working on experiments to look at ethos, so the perceived image of the speaker, whether rephrasing affects the perception that people have of you as a speaker, for instance, and other effects. And of course, try to describe the argumentative profile of rephrase, because it seems that also we have another experiment where we see that people basically see it as paraphrase, but it behaves like an argument. So there is something interesting about that. On the methodological side, we're really working with the corpus team to have a back and forth arrow loop so that our results inform their practice and their practice informs our results. This is one of the deliverables of the project. We are missing, but we are working on experiments to collect behavioral evidence with indirect measures. So we want to have experiments where we show that without asking people whether they find it persuasive, finding a way of it's establishing whether rephrasing does change something in the way they process information. So basically asking them about agreement and stuff like that, but this is in the making. And anything you want to suggest. We're very open to suggestions and criticism, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, and the rest of the team. Okay, thanks, and for stop sharing, because that makes me able to see all the hands that were up, and I didn't really see who was first, but maybe Tom and then Billy.
That was an applause, not a question.
Okay.
Applause hand.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, so Billy then.
Okay. I also was really just applauding, but I do want to ask something, which is just about how you're going to control different kinds of variables, other things that affect it. So the minute you compare the rephrase with the non-rephrase, you're also changing other things, aren't you? And that's really tricky. And relatedly, so I hope it doesn't count as sneaking in two questions, I'm thinking of things like we are more easily persuaded of something we already believe. And can there be places where rephrase will not work because, for example, it's supporting something I really don't want to think is right?
Yes, yes, of course. So to avoid confounding variables, we really try to minimize the changes between conditions. Sometimes it's just one word. Now, there are things, of course, we cannot control, like prior beliefs. Now, in the upcoming experiments that we're thinking about, we actually want to see if people are swayed by rephrase. We will need to control for that. So there are two ways of going about this. Either we have closed world scenarios which are devoid of any social, political, any touchy or potentially biasing representation, and ask people to reason or infer stuff only from the situation and the information we give them. Or in the selection of participants, by the way, I didn't mention we selected participants on prolific, and there's a number of things you can check. So we can, for instance, know the political orientation. Say if this is happening in the US, we can know whether participants are Democrat or Republican, and then we can include that, including in the statistical analysis, to see whether our variables, our conditions do have an effect. But you're right, this is a nightmare when you have to come up with items, because there are so many things that you don't know can actually be going on. Yeah. Well, we can only hope to reduce as much as possible variation between conditions to hope that the effect we observe is indeed due to that.
Thank you.
Okay, Tom, now you really have a hand.
Yes, I do. Thank you for the talk, Steve. Can you help me? You've moved on my screen. There you are. Okay. Can you help me situate your work with something I feel I understand better, and I want to connect the dots, as it were. So I want to ask about epistemic vigilance in particular. So epistemic vigilance is, on the one hand, crucial to the ordinary operation of ostensive communication. On the other hand, it's the flip side. It's the balancing act to capacities of argumentation and reason. Mm-hmm. You didn't say too much about the relationship of your work to that. Can you help me just join the dots, please?
So of course, when you look at the evaluation of arguments, it's not just about comprehension. You evaluate arguments based on a number of things, and I think epistemic vigilance is right there. In terms of content, of course, you evaluate the consistency between the information that you get and what you already have. And then in terms of source, monitoring the source, of course, I would be likely to reject anything coming from Trump, just as anyone. I mean, that also factors in. Now, what we wanted to do here is try to see whether on the side of content, there is, you're gone.
Oh, I moved.
Oh, no, you're there, sorry. I couldn't find you anymore.
I lowered my hand and it moved me on the screen.
Okay, that's fine. We wanted to see in terms of content, so removing these things, whether the extent conditions of relevance can be played with to try to increase or decrease the persuasiveness of a message. So we're at the very beginning, but this will be done also in conjunction with another question of the kind, how trustworthy do you find the speaker? And we do already have some evidence that it goes together. So for some types of rephrase, specification in particular, not generalization, they correlate. So the more you find it persuasive, the more you find the speaker trustworthy, and vice versa. But yeah, so I didn't name epistemic vigilance, but it's there in the background.
Okay, thank you.
And I have to mention also that we went for rephrase because that's a project we have right now, but presumably there are tons of ways of increasing processing effort and tons of ways of increasing cognitive effect, not just rephrase. It just so happens that Dan Blakemore has worked on it, so we have a ready-made theoretical account that shows that it's supposed to be more relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not attempting to say you should have done that. I'm just trying to join the dots.
Sure.
Things I do understand.
Thanks.
So we have about 4 minutes. Can I just ask you quickly, since I have the mic, just to, you mentioned specification and generalization. In your experiment that you reported to us, the reformulation was a specification.
Yes.
And that did make it more persuasive. If it was a generalization, would it be less persuasive?
That's evidence we have from the second experiment after the pilots that I didn't talk about today, because it wasn't also in an argumentative setting. But yes, apparently, so in the first graph I showed you, you saw inference condition high and then rephrase a bit lower and then no rephrase very low. In fact, if you take off generalization, the rephrase condition goes up. We had half and half specifications, half generalization. And that might have to do with with the fact that generalizing makes it perhaps a bit more vague. It also depends on the items. All of these were taken from debates, so it also stands to reason that the more specific you are, perhaps the more believable you are. Yeah.
Can, on the top of your head, give us an example of a generalization reformulation?
Yeah, I can even show you if I just share my screen for a second. Do you see this? Can you see the Excel file? Oh, actually, no, sorry, this is just generalization. No, wait, then I don't have it at hand. So no, okay, so never mind. So you can rephrase something. Team, help me out if you have one, just feel free to say it. But generalization would be generalizing from a particular instance to a higher order category.
The lockdown
so we're
example.
slow in cutting price in lockdown measures. No, in telling people to stay home, and then we were slow in our response to COVID. So you would move up a category. These happen on many different axes. You can specify and generalize on quantity from many to most. You can do it on an axiological basis. Good, best. You can do it on many different axes. So we also have to have some solid semantic classification to start exploring that in detail.
Very interesting. 2 minutes left, and there's time for one more question before we move to the next session.
I think Deirdre.
Deirdre, yeah.
You have to unmute yourself.
Maybe just repeating something that came up before because my computer cut out at the beginning of the question session, but it looked as if it had been discussed. It's that there are two ways in which rephrase can be persuasive or convincing or something like that. One is the fact that the speaker has rephrased it means he really believes it. And so you go through the speaker. And the other is it actually the argument convinces you. Was that something you'd already discussed? And you were saying that there are many different ways of being persuasive. Yeah. Is that right? Yeah.
So we haven't really discussed this, but it's also part of what we want to test, because presumably rephrase can be, if you take the Aristotelian persuasive triangle of ethos, logos, and pathos, presumably you can go in all three. We looked at logos because we were interested in content, but on the speaker's side, of course, there are things that can be done. I have a vague intuition that a specifying speaker would be giving evidence of some sort of expertise or skill when they specify in a way that is intelligible and comprehensible. And that could also affect the perception of the speaker and therefore the persuasiveness of the message.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Let's thank the speaker and
Thank you.
the team. Generally very interesting talk. And just so we can keep moving,